The president right now is out there saying, I just passed a huge tax cut. I want to say that he didn't. You might say, that seems weird. What he's done is mostly left spending alone. The thing is, when you borrow money to spend, someone has to pay it. So I'm not going to, which means someone else is. And the way they're going to pay it is through taxes. That someone else, by the way, is probably my kids. He hasn't cut taxes. He's redistributed them across time. That's really, really, really important.
Hi, I'm Fergus Macphee and welcome to the Trump Report on Times Radio. A reminder, you can watch us every day, Monday through Friday on our YouTube channel, and you can also listen and follow the show wherever you get your podcasts. Joining me today, once again, is Justin Wolfers, Professor of Public Policy and Economics at the University of Michigan. Justin, it's been a while since we last spoke, but thanks for coming back on. How are you?
Mate, you have got the slowest beat in all of journalism. If only there was something to talk about.
Well, we've got plenty to talk about today, as we always do on the Trump Report. But we are talking this morning, of course, after the US House of Representatives has passed Donald Trump's huge tax and spending bill. He called it the One Big Beautiful Bill. Other people have called it the Mega Bill. We won't use either of those words. The important thing is it passed 218 votes to 214, then passed the Senate by one vote, and it will, we think, be signed into law today. Can you just give us a little bit of a refresh on what is in the bill and why there was some opposition from Republicans over its passing?
Okay. So the main feature of the bill is renewing the Trump tax cuts from 2017. Why do we need to renew them? It's complicated. You need to understand how the American Congress works. Most times to get legislation through, you need 60 votes in the Senate. There's a loophole called budget reconciliation. You can get through with 51 votes, but that means you can't increase the deficit beyond 10 years, which means every time you pass a law like this, it has to sunset. So Trump's last go at tax reform ended. He's back in power. He gets to restart it. So that's the main part of it. Now, there's a lot more going on, but I just want to give the audience sort of the broad overview, which is $4 trillion in tax cuts, $1 trillion in spending cuts. So therefore, by the magic of subtraction, we're blowing out the deficit by $3 trillion. Let me add two more things. The spending cuts predominantly are coming from cuts to Medicaid, which is a government insurance program that covers working and middle-class Americans. So that has caused a lot of gnashing of teeth and hand-wringing, particularly among those who are predisposed to care about working and middle-class Americans. You asked the question, why has it been difficult for Trump to get this passed? And it's been very difficult. It was a tiebreaker in the Senate, so 50 to 51, and only by a couple of votes in the House. This for an all-in Republican bill with the president's full-throated approval. And I think there's two answers. One's political and the other's economic, and they're closely related. The political one, the Trump coalition is the most unusual political coalition you could imagine. It's the Republican Party, the plutocrats, the golfers, the country club folks, the management consultants, Wall Street, the low tax folks. Then you can add on a few libertarians who hang on to the Republicans because they still believe that's where libertarian values were. Among the country club set, there's a certain set of fiscal conservatives, sort of a Romney Republican. Among the libertarians, you have anti-deficit hawks, people who think that blowing out the budget is a real problem. They want the government to be smaller. They want debt to be smaller. They want leverage that others might have over the US to be small. And then, so all of that was sort of Reagan's coalition. And then there's the populist, the guy who turns up to rural and working class towns and has won the adulation of many working class Americans, folks who the Democrats may have taken for granted, who Democrats may have seen as their constituency, even if they weren't reliable voters. And those populists are mad. And they want things torn down. I think the strongest sense I get is of rage at a system they feel isn't serving them well. The thing is, when you've got populist rage at a system that isn't serving you well in the same party as the country club and Wall Street, that's a fragile coalition. Now to the economics, to answer your question, I'm going on a lot this morning. I'm sorry, Fergus. But it blows out the deficit. Already, last year, before this, the US budget deficit was 6.4% of GDP, which, to put that in English, because not all of us have graphs in our head, in 2007, before the financial crisis, the US budget deficit hadn't been that high in 50 years. Even during the worst recession, we wouldn't blow out spending that much. So our deficit right now is the sort of deficit that would make sense at a moment of economic crisis, even though we're not, hopefully, in one. And then this adds to that deficit. So if Republicans ever were fiscal conservatives, there's a really big if in that sentence, but there's a lot of people who identify that way. This is the opposite, and that is why Trump has had trouble keeping it together.
You talked about the sort of broad umbrella of people within the Republican Party then, all the different groups. If we get onto the kind of specifics of the bill itself, who will, in your mind, this bill benefit and who will bear the brunt of it?
Right. Fabulous question. So to go back and paint a picture, remember the traditional country club Republicans want low taxes, particularly on the wealthy. They believe in capital, unleashing the power of investment. The populist wing is working and middle-class folks angry at the system. These tax cuts all go here. They all go to the wealthy. They all go to extending corporate tax cuts. They all go to partnerships. It's a terrific time to be driving a BMW to the golf club. So in a deep sense, it is a betrayal of the president's populist moment. So let me just put a little flesh on these bones. What we have is huge tax cuts that go predominantly to the rich, but they do touch the middle class. Trump was very careful to make sure they touched the middle class. They might touch you, but if someone else is getting the real bonus and it's not you. The spending cuts, all of a sudden they can find the poor because they're Medicaid predominantly, which is used by working middle class Americans. So they're also very regressive, hurt the poor, don't touch the rich. And then the part that's not part of the budget, but is part of the fiscal plan is tariffs. You might say, why aren't tariffs part of the budget? And it's simply because the tariffs are coming through executive orders from the president and that whole business about reconciliation, which is more complicated and uninteresting than your audience cares about. But if they're going to keep tariffs, serious tariffs, and it looks like we're going to learn that that's in fact the case, tariffs are like a sales tax. And so they're roughly a flat share of your spending, and lower income folks spend a larger share of their income than higher income folks. And so therefore tariffs take a bigger chunk out of the income of lower income folks than higher income folks. Add those three regressive things up together, and what you get is the very richest Americans, the top 1/10, will come out about $7,000 a head per year. The next richest, which you might call either the lower upper class or the upper middle class, they come out dead even. So we've accounted for 20% of the population. If those folks are getting a bunch, someone else is paying for it. It's everyone else. It's 80% of the American population. And it's not even just that. Because this is so regressive, the very poorest the working class, are paying literally the most in dollars, not in a percentage, in dollars. So for the poorest 1/10, they're going to lose about $2,500 a year, which if you're trying to make do on $20,000 a year is a big chunk of change. So the likelihood is the typical Trump voter is going to end up financially worse off. Now, that's not a very interesting statistic because the typical person is going to end up quite a bit worse off.
Is the important thing to mention, though, politically, is this a little bit of a masterstroke? Because you've obviously got the midterms next year. Straight away, you might see, the top line of, tax cuts, which might hit before then, and yet the deficit increase and the cuts to Medicare, is it right that they'll actually come after? the midterms?
Oh, the question, is it a political masterstroke? So let me start with the humorous take on that. Is it a political masterstroke that a billionaire from New York can get working and middle-class Americans who are struggling in rural areas and feel that the system has screwed them to vote for a candidate who will redistribute from working and middle-class Americans to the rich? It's unbelievable. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but boy, if you wanted to be one, you would say, by jingo, we took those guys for a ride. This is the largest redistribution from poor to rich in a single bill in American history. And it's supported by the poor. Incredible. Okay, so now let me come back. You're asking about a different form of cynical politics. There's so many forms of cynical politics. So let me explain to the audience. Remember I said under reconciliation, the particular procedure they're using, you can't blow out the deficit in the future. So the trick they use is they pass a bunch of stuff and they have some of it disappear at various points over the next 10 years, because these are budgets that are really over a 10-year window. And it turns out all the pain, the cuts to Medicaid, come after the midterms. They're just like, we have a really, really urgent, important reform that we stand behind, which is why we're definitely going to implement it only after the election. And all of the joy comes up front. In fact, the things the president ran on, which is no tax on tips, no tax on overtime. First of all, he watered those programs down. Secondly, in this budget, those programs exist for the next 2 years and then disappear. And in fact, many of the goodies disappear before the election, after the election, or at least they disappear at the end of the Trump presidency. So some disappear after the midterms and some after the Trump presidency. So the set of policies as a whole look like they were written in the country club. The timing of the policies looked like they were written in a Washington, D.C. basement with political operatives smoking fat cigars.
Okay, I'm going to ask you to be in full-on economist explainer mood here, Justin. So I think it happens in the UK as well. A lot of the time when we see headlines about the economy, the debt, interest rates, growth, a lot of the time people don't quite understand what it means to them day to day, okay? So I think the US debt that currently stands at $36 trillion. We've said this bill is expected to increase it by over $3 trillion in the next 10 years. What will that actually mean to everyday Americans?
So first of all, understanding what the debt is a very hard question. So you just said 36 trillion. That's correct. But actually, 7 trillion of that is money that one part of the government owes to another. So folks who are trying to scare you talk about 36 trillion. Folks who are trying to tell you the truth talk about 29 trillion. And that's, by the way, a tell for the audience. If someone says 36 trillion, not you, Fergus, you're a wonderful person. Maybe a producer misled you on this. And I know you want to be honest. But really, if someone tells you 36 trillion, that's a tell they're lying to you. So it's 29 trillion. And then you say, well, what does 29 trillion do? Well, you could think about what is your debt relative to your annual income. That's what a person might do. Well, here it's going to be awfully close to 100%. That's not a magic number. What that means is the size of how much the United States government owes is equal to total production in the United States over 365 days. That's still so that's the second thing. I think I've said this on your show before. Anytime someone talks in trillions, they're trying to make sure you don't understand. So what I just did is I turned it into something a little more interpretable. It's basically 1 year's income or 1 year's production in the United States. How worrying is that? One way of thinking about it, if I think about, can I afford my family's mortgage, is I compare the interest payments to my income. And so if you do that, the interest payments will probably be about 3.5% or 4% of our annual income. So it's clear we can pay it. Can is different than want to, right? I would much rather not pay 4% of my income just in an interest bill. So that right there, you don't need to ask an economist. This is simply arithmetic. If you spend 4% of your income and get nothing back, it doesn't feel good. That's the most important thing, which is government is going to have to write a lot of checks and not build roads with it, not create education, not create national defense, not do anything that brings us any joy. Okay, so what are the other broader implications of this? The more money you borrow, the more that you're seen as a risk of not repaying it. That's as true for people as it is for countries. A reasonable rule of thumb, now I'm really going to nerd out for folks at home, is for every 1% you raise the debt to GDP ratio, remember that's the thing that's about 100% right now, you raise interest rates by about 0.02%, which sounds small. But if you are on track to raise the debt to GDP ratio by, say, 25%, so from 100 to 125, which is roughly what we're on track to do over the next decade, 25 times 2 100ths equals 50 100ths, which equals a half. So what that then says is that interest rates in the United States are probably going to rise by about 0.5 percentage point as a result of this budget. What does that mean? Well, first of all, when you owe someone $29 trillion, 0.5% turns out to be a lot. And so our interest payments will rise again because of that. Secondly, almost all interest rates charged to Americans are keyed off of that government bond rate. So what that means then is my mortgage payment's going to rise by 0.5%. If you own a house that's worth $500,000, if interest were to rise by 1%, that would be $5,000 a year. So that 0.5% would cost you $2,500 a year. And it's not just your house, it's your car loan, it's your credit card, it's student loans, and so on. Those higher interest rates also are going to mean that folks are less willing to invest. Breaking ground on a new factory is no longer such a good deal if you have to pay the bank so much more. And so that would slow economic growth. Now, all of that's manageable, but it's a cost, right? I'm not giving a gloom and doom story.
Is there a gloom and doom story?
Are you really fascinated? Do you really want to hear that or not?
Oh, well, I think both I and our audience would love to hear that.
Okay, I just didn't want to talk too long without involving my good friend Fergus. It's an occupational hazard of being a professor. Okay, so here's the terrifying thing. Actually, I'm going to start with really good news. We're currently in a world where we can repay our debts, and the world understands we can repay our debts. So therefore, the world charges us low interest rates. Because the world charges us low interest rates, we can repay our debts. That's terrific. There's another world we could enter. If the world starts to believe we can't repay our debts, they're going to jack up our interest rates. They jack up our interest rates, the amount we have to pay to service our debt goes up. If that happens, maybe we can't repay our debts. So you can move from one situation to another if you're at risk of the possibility that if interest rates rise enough, it becomes too much and we can't bear it. So that's the risk. Once your debt gets as high as we are, staying in this happy, virtuous cycle is wonderful, but it raises the possibility that if we enter the vicious cycle, we're screwed. Whereas if our debt were low, even if interest rate payments went up, we could still afford it, right? But now debt's high, so now that raises the possibility. So that's called a crisis of confidence. You might say, well, could that happen to a country like America?
How likely, say after this bill, for example, how likely might something like that be to happen to the US?
I want to be clear, unlikely. But I also want to point out that this actually happens to serious countries. So this is the story of what happened to Greece in the financial crisis. Everyone thought they couldn't pay their debts, jacked up their rates, they couldn't pay their debts. And so Greece went from a very happy fiscal situation. We all thought it was an advanced economy. Maybe we didn't look hard enough. And then kaput. Could that happen in America? Yes. Do I think it would happen in America? Was I worried about this happening in America over the last 20 years? No, for two reasons. One, our debt was much lower. And two, the other thing that could cause that precipitating event of everyone believes to no one believes is unstable political leadership. I don't know. For some reason, I start worrying about that these days.
I guess I go back to one of my previous questions as well. If, obviously, you'd said it's a big if something like that does happen, I guess by the time it does, Donald Trump will likely be long gone from power as well.
This is where I'm going to be an economist and say, I don't care who's to blame, I just want to avoid it. And, you know, our debt is the result of 50 years of history. It's the result of COVID. It's the result of the Great Recession. It's the result of Obama and Biden and Bush and Reagan. And it's also the result of Trump. The president right now is out there saying, I just passed a huge tax cut. I want to say that he didn't. You might say, that seems weird. What he's done is mostly left spending alone. The thing is, when you borrow money to spend, someone has to pay it. So I'm not going to, which means someone else is. And the way they're going to pay it is through taxes. That someone else, by the way, is probably my kids. He hasn't cut taxes. He's redistributed them across time. That's really, really, really important. If I were politically conservative and what I wanted was tax cuts, I would be pissed because he hasn't cut them. He's done the politically easy thing of saying, you guys don't have to pay, but we'll make someone else pay it. There's an old expression which says the only way to cut taxes is to cut spending. If you cut spending, then you haven't created any future tax obligations. So then you are actually cutting tax obligations, not just switching them across time and who gets to pay them.
No, thank you so much, Justin. That was a fantastic explainer on a complicated issue. We're just going to move on to something that I've spoken to you about in the past. It's the tariffs, because next week they will be rearing their head again. Wednesday, the 9th of July, is the deadline for Trump's 90-day pause. Now, he said that he wanted to do 90 deals in 90 days. We're 85 days in as we speak. How are we doing ahead of the pause ending next week?
I think we're at 2.5.
You would be right. UK, Vietnam, and sort of China, I think.
Right. And what we are at is it is easier to trade with no country on earth today than it was in 2024. It's more expensive for Americans to trade with any country in the world than it was in 2024. We are more isolated today than we were in 2024. What we may not be right now is with 2.5 countries, we may be better off than we were on April 2nd, Liberation Day. There's a lovely continuity to this discussion, by the way, because we went from talking about taxes to talking about tariffs. Oh, taxes. The first was about taxes on the American people. This is about taxes on the American people. But you had a question, sir.
I guess the question is, I'm going to ask you to use your crystal ball slightly on what is actually going to happen next week. He said that he's not going to extend the current deadline and that he's going to be sending out letters to sort of certain countries and trading partners today. We don't actually know which countries yet are going to be expected to pay what. Do you have any thoughts and predictions in your crystal ball?
Yes. So first of all, what have we been doing for 90 days? I think you might enjoy the following analogy. Because a trade deal is when you sit down with someone and you work out, hey, how can we both be better off? How can you enrich our economy and you enrich and we enrich yours? That requires a conversation. What he's doing is sending out letters. So my analogy is a letter is to a trade deal as masturbation is to sex. Whatever you're dreaming about, there's only one person in the room. And if there were two, there would be the opportunity to each make each other a whole lot better off. But that's not how masturbation works.
That might be a first for the Trump report. That might be the first time masturbation's been mentioned on the show.
But in a very economically sophisticated way, right? So we're now sending letters. So what that means is we didn't do deals. The deal maker failed to do deals. By the way this all started was he held up a big board that listed numbers that he unilaterally decided. And the only thing that's changed over 90 days is he's going to take the board, put it on its side, photocopy it down to letter size and send it in the mail. So that means nothing happened over 90 days. That's my frustration speaking. Now, let me come back and try and be a little more analytic. The president said he's expecting to send out 10 letters a day. I should teach him how to do a mail merge. I could do it quicker. The second thing is he said he expects rates between 10 and 70%. That kind of suggests we might be back to Liberation Day. It suggests that we are going to have the highest tariff rates in post-war America. It says that we're going to have tariff rates that are 5, 10, or maybe 20 times higher than other industrialized nations. And it seems to suggest that the president is utterly intent on isolating Americans from the rest of the world. I have been surprised that financial markets freaked out the first time and haven't freaked out the second time. Maybe they don't believe that this is what's going to happen. This is the old, will this be Taco Tuesday, Trump always chickens out, or Tariff Tuesday? He's speaking as if it's going to be Tariff Tuesday, in which case you and I get to continue this long and glorious conversation that we enjoy, where we talk about Trump and tariffs every time your audience needs to know what's going on.
Well, we can hold that thought. As you say, I'm sure it won't be the last we hear about it on the Trump Report. Justin, thank you so much for joining us as always.
Great pleasure, Fergus.